Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that the right book at the right time can change lives, and that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do here on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature: picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels for readers of all ages. In each episode, we'll talk with children's literature authors and discuss their books, their hopes, their dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. Whether you're an adult reading to their inner child or connecting the young readers in your life with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. So grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back to another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today I'm talking with Tony Keith Jr. Tony is an award-winning poet, spoken word artist, and hip-hop educational leader. He's the author of How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, a young adult memoir in verse, and he's here today to talk about his newest release, Knucklehead, a brilliant and electric poetry collection that subverts a narrow way of thinking and empathizes with young people who are misunderstood and unheard. It's a provocative collection, listeners, and I can't wait to talk about it. So we'll just go straight to the episode. Tony, welcome to KidLit Love.
Hello. What's up? Good to be here. Hi, Stephanie. Hi, listeners. Hello.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're here today. If we think about the episodes that I have on the podcast, I get to talk to a lot of picture book authors, a lot of middle grade readers, and less young adult authors and poets. So I am really excited to have this conversation about your amazing collection today.
Thank you. I'm excited because, well, we could probably talk about it later, but I never, ever saw myself, like writing books, let alone young adult books. So that's,
Oh yes, we will talk about that then.
yeah.
We might as well just get right to it then. Now I dropped kind of three nuggets in the opening about you. Award-winning poet,
Yeah.
spoken word artist,
Yeah.
hip-hop educational leader.
Yeah.
I've poked around on your website in preparation for the episode, and you're doing a lot of really cool, meaningful, pretty amazing things. And so I would love for you to just start there, toot your own horn for a little bit in the podcast, and tell us about you and your writing and how you got here to writing adult.
Got it. So many things to share. And so I'm thinking so much about the fact that, if you were on my website, then you read the bio. And I'm thinking to myself, like, that really is like the shortest, like, there's no way to like reduce it. So yes, I am a poet. I am a spoken word artist, meaning I write for the page and I write for the stage. I am a hip hop educational leader, which essentially means this is based on my dissertation research. So I'm also an academic, but essentially embodying hip hop culture sort of in my way of being. I'm not a rapper. Sometimes people might think that, but I do not rap. But I am a mover of the crowds. I'm very much an MC. So I love to, or within the education space, I say a sort of demonstrate a mastery of student learning and engagement conditions, right? But this idea that I understand an audience. I love spoken word. I am a 80s baby, grew up in the 90s, was very much involved in sort of like 90s hip hop culture and baggy jeans and fun language, but I was also right. Just absorbing the culture of this movement, this fun thing. And so within that were rappers. And I would read the lyrics to a lot of rap music back when people would read the lyrics of, and I realizing that Tupac was a poet, Queen Latifah, a poet, Missy Elliott, a poet, so many of my favorite, LL Cool J, like so many of my favorite at least rappers I heard growing up as a kid were writing poetry. But I was also reading poetry written by like Nikki Giovanni and Langston Hughes. But my point is most of the poems and the rhythmic language that I was exposed to was outside of school, not necessarily in school. And so within school, so readers should know my very first book, How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, I talk about this is I was always writing poetry, but the poetry that I was writing to myself was poetry that I was sort of secretly writing because I didn't want the world to kind of know what was going on with me. And so listeners should know that at least in my first book, I talk about this. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. I live in my hometown. My father was in military. I grew up on a military base in Washington, D.C. My very, very young parents. But my father got dealt with some drug addiction, substance abuse issues, and him and my mom got divorced, and so we had to move off this base, move to the suburbs of Prince George's County, Maryland, which is where I graduated high school. And I became the first person in my family to go to college. And meanwhile, all of this is going on. My parents divorced, my dad's drug addiction, moving, and I am pretty sure that I think that I'm gay, right? This is I think the nugget that really sinks it in is in high school. I had a girlfriend. Um, but I'm pretty sure that I think that I had crushes on boys. And so I was secretly sort of writing poetry, just sort of about this experience of like, I'm feeling very othered. I don't understand. I don't really have language to describe what's going on. I didn't have the language for like racism and homophobia because I was being bullied and teased by teachers and playground, and so I didn't have the language for that. So I was always someone who wrote poems. And so that would, I think, is what leads us to this point of Knucklehead and even how the boogeyman became a poet is because I was always writing poetry to myself to sort of just like understand what was going on in my world. It wasn't until about 2019, right before the pandemic, I'm about to defend my dissertation, and I get laid off from my full-time job. Right, I'm doing youth development work in Washington D.C. for several high schools, and short story, nonprofit loses a bunch of money and I get laid off. And I'm mid writing my dissertation. Right. And so the only way that I knew how to survive was on poems. I've always sort of like, if you like earn a little extra like passive income, sort of performing or writing or consulting, I was doing that kind of work. And what wound up happening was, I was also in therapy at the same time. And my therapist was like, Tony, you've been writing poetry since you were a kid. Where are those poems at? Right. And so I remember unpacking the poems that I wrote as a kid. I still had them. I still had them. I still have them here.
I love that.
I'll
Thank
be I'll
goodness.
be 44 years old and I still have the handwritten poems. And so what happens is I spent a weekend in 2019 going through hundreds, I think, of handwritten poems that I wrote as a kid. And it was spiritual, Stephanie. Like I cried. One of them I set on fire. I mean, it was like a whole thing, but I was like, wow, this is how I've always processed my world. And so Knucklehead is a collection, my new book is a collection of poems that I've been writing to myself over the last 30 years, essentially dealing with my world as a black gay man in America. And so when Boogeyman became a poet, what readers will see is I was able to take photocopies of the handwritten poems, and they're in that memoir. And then a Knucklehead, they're sort of an extension of, what some of those poems were, but they're an evolution. But like my point is, I still am somebody to this day who writes poems to myself that are not supposed to be seen by anybody.
Yes.
Not the goal.
Yes.
Yeah, and we could probably talk about how that worked, but that is sort of me in a nutshell. I'm this poet, educator guy with this hip hop thing from DC. And since 2019, I've been a full-time writer, author, poet, artist, if that makes sense. I just never went back to like a traditional full-time job. Even with my PhD, I've never been like in a traditional professor.
Yep. Well, that's actually my academic. That's my job, and you know what? I kind of want to be you.
You know what's so interesting is I find this really fascinating because in 2019, so although I survived 2019 just on the poems and finding fellowships and things, and I do defend my dissertation successfully in fall of 2019, but when I enter the job market in fall of 2019, here I am in Washington D.C. area, and and this is hometown for me, so there's very few institutions of higher education sort of in this kind of in the region, and that specifically had like positions open for people with PhDs in education leadership. None of these institutions wanted me. They were like, "Yo, you have this interesting poet, hip hop. You, you just you don't quite fit." I knew that that's what it was. It's like I just didn't quite fit, and I was like, you know what? Maybe there. I just got to carve my own lane. And
That's
so
right.
I,
Thank goodness you did,
yes,
because now, right, this
yeah,
is this is what you're doing.
I'm loving this because, and this is also probably also think about how the books came to be is, I originally thought, and again, this was 2019. So in 2020, I'm still essentially self-employed. And I'm in February of 2020, I'm at the University of South Carolina with my dear friend and like high key my brother. I've known this most of my life, Jason Reynolds, everybody's favorite author. I
Oh
love
gosh, yeah.
yeah, he was like best man in my wedding. Literally, I know him. He's like someone very, very dear to me. And so we were at the University of South Carolina together, and we were doing like a tour around schools and colleges. He's talking about his life as a writer on the page, and I'm talking about my life as a poet on the stage. And Jason is a poet, but I mean, the
Yes.
world knows him mostly from from writing all the books.
Right.
And so we're doing this thing, and so after every event, there's always a book signing, and I'm very used to just sitting there with Jason at the book signing. Like it's just me and James just saying, and I'm like, I think I'm in my phone in one of these book signing lines. And what happened is this woman gets out of line, black woman gets out of line with this little black boy, and he walks right up to me and he's like, Mr. Tony, where's your book? Not right,
There's the
not
universe right there.
it's like, not do you have a book? It's like the book that you have, like where is it? Like I don't
Yep.
understand. And so I go back to my hotel room that night, and it's the honest truth. And I was like, what book is this little boy talking about? Right. And I decide maybe I'm gonna write a young adult version of my dissertation. That's what I figured. I was like, I learned all of this academic knowledge. I'm going to transform this thing about hip hop and education into something really cool and made for young people. Right? That was what I told myself. So that night, I sat in my hotel room and I wrote, I think like the first like 500 words of something.
Yeah.
And the very next morning, me and Jason are having coffee. I'm like, yo, Jay, I think I'm gonna write a book, bro. And I'm saying this to the Jason Reynolds, and he's like, okay, Tony. I'm like, nah, dude, I think I'm gonna do it. So we fly back to DC, and then March 2020, COVID-19 hits. And so then it was this moment of like lockdown,
Yeah.
right? It was a terrible time for educators and to be an artist, right? But then there was all this like grant funding that came about, and I was like, this is the moment. And so
Yeah.
I sat and I wrote what I thought would be a young adult version of my dissertation. I learned how to query literary agents. Like I learned how to just figure out how to get
Figure it out.
book deal. And that's what happened. So I got my agent within 2 months, which I learned is very unheard of.
That
Uh,
is. Yes.
it's
From what
unheard-
I've learned on this podcast, that is
I,
fantastic.
I've learned, especially, because I don't have an MFA, I do not, listeners, I do not have an academic background in English or literature or poetry, or I read a lot, I write a lot, anyway, and so figuring out publishing I'm literally winging it every single day. But I acquired an amazing literary agent, and she tells me, Annie Huang, I love you, Annie. Annie says, Tony, the thing you are writing is not a young adult version of your dissertation. She says, the thing that I would like to help you write, it seems like you want to write memoirs. It seems like, because within this story you're trying to tell about these people you interviewed, you're also telling your story about growing up as a poor gay black closeted boy writing poems. Like that's woven in this somehow. Pull that out and let's see what we can do. And so and I can now tell you how the both of the books happen since I'm already in the story.
Yes,
So
please.
then what happens is so that was like April 2020 is when I signed with my agent. And around 2021, sometime maybe April 2021, maybe a little bit later that year, I am struggling to write a manuscript. I am having, because again, I'm not classically trained in this. I've got this PhD. All I know is 13 letter words, I'm just, and I'm writing with this like very adult kind of voice. Like I just could not figure it out. And my agent says, Tony, we've been going through this book proposal for about a year and some change. Maybe we should consider pivoting. She goes, you're a poet. She goes, I know that you got all the poems. What about we put together a poetry collection? And so because I already have the poems, I was like, all right, we're going to put together this poetry collection called Knucklehead. And I immediately was thinking Knucklehead because I grew up being called a knucklehead, and it was always a term of endearment. But for me, it was always slightly misunderstood, but very lovable little boy, right? And women, like, just someone who just sort of has that narrative of like, you're a problem, but you're also so brilliant and great. And I put together Knucklehead. And it's not exactly as it is right now, but I put together this collection. So in the book proposal, we say, well, here's Knucklehead, but he's also working on this memoir, and I decided to call it How the Boogeyman Became a Poet, which is the last line of one of my poems that I wrote like back in 2010. There's more to that story. So we submit full manuscript of Knucklehead and just this idea that How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. So these two things went out to publishers. What wound up happening was publishers came back and were like, yo, we think this guy's really interesting. This knucklehead thing is cool, but what's this boogeyman? What is
Yeah.
this? What is that? Let's see that thing. And so my agent was like, Tony, I know you don't have it, but
Just start.
can you put together something? And I was like, well, this is the universe sending a
Yeah.
sign. And so and this is now, by the way, I should mention we're in like the end of 2021, early 2022, when all this is kind of going on. And I'm like, all right, well, so I lock myself in my home office and I write for 3 days. And at that point, I had also mentioned to listeners, I had been, again, I say this to be a really good writer. I think you've got to be a really good reader. I started reading a lot more young adult literature. I mean, I was like, Elizabeth Acevedo, Poet X, Mahogany Brown, Chlorine Sky. I was reading Candace Elo, Everybody Looking. You had Jacqueline Woodson, Brown Girl Dreaming. But I'm reading authors who write with this way that felt normal for me. Like my verse was naturally coming out. I just couldn't figure out the form and the structure and the audience. But once I started reading their work, I was like, oh, they
There it
did it.
is. Yes.
All the light bulbs go off. And so I put together the first maybe like 30 pages or so of how the Boogeyman became a poet, and HarperCollins acquired both books. And they said, well, Tony, here's the deal. The publishing world does not know who you are. Your memoir needs to come first, and
Right.
then
Right.
Knucklehead come after. And so that's kind of how we got here. So Boogeyman Became a Poet came out last February, and Knucklehead just launched this February. But readers should know that Knucklehead existed before Boogeyman. But
Right.
after writing Boogeyman, I learned how I wanted to write Knucklehead. And so again, listeners should know, although it is Knucklehead is like 30 years worth of poems around Black masculinity and that kind of topic. It's woven together by these series of letters called like Dear Knucklehead. So it became like this. I think the word that I learned was epistolary.
Yes, they're my favorite novels, Tony. I love epistolary novels.
Yeah, so I was like, what does that mean? I'm learning so much in the publishing world. So I took on this epistolary format because what wound up happening was I'm happy to just tell you all the stories. Um,
I love it.
yeah, a couple years ago, right, I think it was right before, yeah, it was 2023 because Boogeyman was not out yet, but I was facilitating workshops for a group of high school Black teenage boys in Washington, D.C. And it was me and my company, NMC Academy. We're poets and spoken word artists anyway. And we were doing workshops. And I'd said, oh, I got this book coming out next year called How the Boogeyman Became a Poet. I was like, but then the year after that, I got another book coming out called Knucklehead. And I write Knucklehead on the whiteboard, but I misspell it. I forget the E. And so for listeners, if you look at the front cover, the E has like a little
Yes.
misspelling. It's like a little caret underneath it. It's because what I did was I tried to make the correction on the whiteboard. It didn't work. And I put the little caret. And the fellas in the group were like, hey, you should keep it like that.
Yes.
And I went back home and I was like, I'm gonna write Knucklehead to them. And so the letters became this way of threading these 30 years of my own just sort of processing my world embedded with these letters to Knuckleheads. And so that's how the two books essentially kind of came to be.
Okay, that was the best story ever told on the podcast.
Yay! I was like, I've got to figure out a way to condense this. I was like, but this is really what
Yeah.
happened. This is really
No, don't condense it. Yeah, because the all of the way that the pieces fall into place, the people that are there, and then the ideas, then that has this domino effect really to where you are today, sitting with Knucklehead. Did
yeah.
you did you go back to Jason and be like, I told you so?
No, no. I actually never did that, but I will tell you this though. This is what's really, really, really important, right? And so, and I think it's really important to say this because I love Jason Reynolds very much. He's very much a brother, very protective of our friendship, our
Yeah.
brotherhood. He put the blurb, or he gave a blurb that's on the front cover of my book saying a life-affirming masterpiece. The world needs to know Jason Reynolds didn't do that because we're good friends. This is really important. He will tell you if he thinks your work is trash, he will
We will tell you.
and considering his status, he can't just put his name on anything.
Right.
And so I think that for me, what wound up happening was it wasn't a need to go back and be like, see, I told you so. I think that for him, I remember he says, Tony, I knew you could do it. He goes, I knew you had the chops for it, but you were scared.
Yeah.
He was like, you were so stuck into, we've got the spoken word, we need the spoken word. He was like, yeah, we need the written word too. And I'm glad you finally stepped up to the plate.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the way that happens. And so we celebrate each other's literary careers. Uh-oh. Right on that. There we go. All right, we're good. But all the things fell into place. And I think the last thing I'll say is something that I also learned is, you know, because my dissertation, wrestled with lots of complicated topics, racism within education and conditions for student learning and engagement and some bits of homophobia and like all of that stuff, I realized that writing in verse for young adult audiences is my way of making that knowledge accessible. And I think that's the other thing that I really, really love is I'm like, I don't need to write an epistolary or use the word epistemology, right, in this writing, but I can hopefully help readers question things or understand complicated concepts, you know?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And you say in the book there are so many little sticky notes. I love quotes. I love pulling quotes. I love the language. So I have little sticky notes everywhere.
That's great. That's great.
And there's a couple like you're very clear, at one point it's this bold three-word statement that is so true is that words have power.
Yes.
Words have power.
Yes, they do.
And you also a little bit later the line I love, I'd be more lethal in pen than words spoken out
Out
loud.
loud. Yeah.
Love that. I would say you're both because I
Yeah.
listened to you on YouTube and it's both.
I love that because I'm even thinking about just the times when I wrote those two poems because they were written at separate times. So the one about words having power, I think that's the second poem in Knucklehead. I
Yes,
wrote
right at
that
the front.
poem in, yeah, I wrote that poem in 2006, maybe 2007.
Wow.
And this was at a time when, at least in higher education, there was a lot of attention being given to like Black male college student development. There was just sort of a rise of literature and scholarship, like, yo, we need to talk about specifically, it was something about like Black college boys. And I remember being in that academic space with all these PhD folks studying that work anyway. And so I wrote that poem in that moment, thinking about like, what are the narratives that are being told about like Black boys and how we're internalizing that. And, this idea that no, words do have power. So I wrote that poem in 2006. But the other poem you're talking about when it says, I'd be more lethal in pen than words
Yes.
spoken out loud. I wrote that poem in like 2020
Wow.
or 2019, so 10 or actually 13, whatever, 14 years later, while writing my dissertation. Right. So it was, and there are a
Oh,
lot of there are a lot of poems in Knucklehead, well, not a lot, but quite a few that I wrote while dissertating. It was something about the way my brain was working. It was like, Tony, you're wrestling with these heavy concepts, and then you need to kind of I don't know, there was something about needing to like digest or produce something else. And so I was writing these sort of resistant poems at the same time while writing this academic thing. And so I realized in that moment, I was like, yo, when I put pen on paper, ooh, I get it's a little serious out here, you know? And I think about that too, even with writing my dissertation. So what listeners should know is that my PhD is in education leadership. And I got it at George Mason University, a predominantly white institution. And my dissertation committee, most of them were white folks, which is not a bad thing, but none of them looked like me or really quite understood my experience. But my chair at the time happened to be early 70s, white male, former superintendent in the state of Texas.
Oh.
And here I am, all Black in the poems and the spoken word and the education and the hip hop and the after school programs. And then he's like, I don't know what this is all about, and also listeners should know, although my PhD is in education, my master's is in education, I've never been a classroom teacher. I've never traditionally worked in a school. I have worked in colleges and universities as an administrator, but most of my education work as a leader is nonprofit. It's
Yeah.
managing out of school time. I was moving in that space, and there were no theories at the time discussing people like me, at least published in the academic space. So anyway, so all I have to say is by the time I get to writing my dissertation, this man is in love with everything. He's like, oh, I get it now. And I realized, like, oh, I got to write to you. I
Yeah.
need to write to you. In the grand scheme of things, white, straight, affluent, Christian, like you sort of represent kind of the dominant ideas in academia. And so if I can write this dissertation to you as my audience, you know what I mean? Then I think I see you, and I'm also trying to teach you something, and that I think that worked really well. And he wound up nominating I got the Outstanding Dissertation of the Year award. Um,
Oh, that's hard. Good for
yeah,
you.
yeah, 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 from two different places, from the American Education Research Association. They have a hip hop.
AER, good out.
Yeah, I got the Outstanding Dissertation Award from them and from George Mason, and so I'm thinking to myself, like, got it, like,
Yes.
yeah, I'm lethal with the.
Yes. Yes. And I'm glad you brought that up about writing to that audience
Yeah.
because in the reviews of the book or people talking about your book, it's been called a love letter in verse to Black boys and men.
Mhm.
But this white woman read
Yeah.
it and thought
Yeah.
it was written for her too.
You know what I love about this is really important because and I love it's funny because I read one review that also said, rapper Tony. I'm like, I'm not a rapper. Reviews everything because so here's the thing. When I sit down at my computer or at least my laptop, whatever, and I think about who I'm writing to, the audience that I visualize usually are a group of like little black boys. And I always say black boys and men, especially the gay and queer ones, but then I also say, and the people who love us.
Yes, you did say that at the start of this episode, and I wrote it down because it was so
Yeah.
powerful.
So, because
Yeah,
what I realize is like, although my like primary audience, if that makes sense, like the people who I visualize are little black boys who, like, if you're listeners, you can't see my office setting, but they're just pictures of just like
gorgeous.
black boys, So, like, for me, that's just who I think about, but also think about people like you who love me and who love people like us. And, and one of my friends, black woman, she goes, Tony, I'm a knucklehead too, and so I think about it in that regard. So, yeah, I'm glad you picked up on that because, yes, although there's a specific people that I think about. I know that that writing is also attached to so many others. I was in a independent bookstore. I love indie bookstores. Shout out to indie bookstores. A couple like last week, and I read a lot of young adult work. This is the truth. I don't read a lot. I mean, I do read some adult work, but you can usually find me in the teen
Yep.
children's section. I'm just there. I don't care. And I'm in this indie bookstore, and I see both How the Boogeyman Became a Poet and Knucklehead on shelves together. And there's this little white boy, right, standing next to these books. He's not picking either of them up. And I'm standing kind of next to him, and I'm like, he doesn't know that there are two books right there that I wrote. I'm going to tell him about this book. And so I sparked a little conversation with him, not in a weird way, listeners. It's not like I'm
Right.
a creep adult in a bookstore preying on kids, but I was like, hey, just so you know, I wrote these two books. This one is about this, and I explained them. Anyway, literally the next day, I received an Instagram message from a 14-year-old little kid who said, hey, I met you in the bookstore yesterday. I read your book. It was so great and inspiring. And I thought to myself, like, oh, a 14-year-old little white boy. You know what I mean? I'm like, I think that's what I mean about in terms of the connection. It's sort of like, yo, if anything, I want readers to be brought in by the language, be brought in by the story, the narrative. Who I'm writing to is kind of who I'm writing to. That's just my natural. I can't boil the ocean. It's like
Right.
I'm writing to everybody in the world.
Right.
It's a very
Right.
difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah, but because you put your story so openly and so heartfelt and so beautifully on the page, right? Readers feel it. No matter who you are, you feel it, and you feel it in the way that you need to, or
Mm,
you're provoked in the way that you need to. You just think and feel, and that's why, right? Just it sounds like all of you is on the page for all of us to find.
yeah, it
Yeah.
is. I'm realizing, and I don't know what this is about. Maybe I'll figure it out. Maybe this is probably what another book might be about. Is I there's something about being this vulnerable in public
Yeah.
that is really freeing for me in some sort of way. There's sort of this, I'm like, well, now the world knows well, not all the things, but I'm like, there are poems in there about, I've been married to my husband now for 70, it'd be 70 years this year. And I'm like, there are poems in there about us,
Yeah.
very things that I wrote. Yeah, like there. Oh, thanks. I'm like there are things that I wrote while he wasn't looking or while he wasn't, And my husband loves me. He loves the fact that I'm a poet, but he doesn't really get into all the. I'm sure he's read my books. Maybe I don't know. I don't know. But I think about. I've learned that what, if anything, I think my vulnerability, my hope is that it inspires readers to also be okay being a little vulnerable, but maybe even to stretch their imagination quite a bit. And by that I mean, I remember at one point when I think I was probably writing How the Boogeyman Became a Poet or somewhere in this process and was thinking about, you know, I don't really know many books that were talking about like closeted gay black, like there was this, I was like, I don't know where this literature exists.
Yeah.
Right. And I knew at the time the rise of George and Johnson and somebody else. But anyway, my point is there was this book that came out by Robert Jones Jr. It's an adult book, novel called The Prophets. And The Prophets essentially it's a fictionalized tale of two enslaved black gay men. And I know, and I read that book, and it's thick, and it's huge, and I was so engulfed in this story because I was like, "Dude, dude, we will never know really what this experience was like." But it's like, Tony, of course there were gay and queer enslaved. Like, of course. And so for me, it awakened this possibility of like, oh my gosh, this is what books can do. Even, even if, it's not exactly accurate, you can give readers this idea, this thought, this. And so I'm like, I've been thinking about that. It's like, I want to write books where folks are like, yo, I wonder what it was like to be like a black gay man in the 90s and 2000s during this particular administration. And, like what was life like what was going on,
Yeah,
what's it like to be married to a man? Like, what's it like to have a wedding day? Like, ah,
yeah. So that reminds me of another line that I pulled from the book, and I don't know if I'm gonna have it completely correct, but it
right?
was, for those that maybe didn't have their voice yet or weren't sure of sharing the voice of how you would carry them.
Ah,
Our work would carry them as long as we pick up those that are left
left behind.
behind.
Yes, yes, yes.
And
And I think
goosebumps.
thank you.
Goosebumps.
And the next poem after that, I'm pretty sure is the one that says the one stuck in bars. Um, yeah, and so again, so that last line that you're talking about is pick up left behind is from the same poem that I wrote in 2006. The poem that follows that, the one stuck behind bars, came about probably around like 3 or 4 years ago as well. And I'll be back there in a couple weeks. But I was facilitating workshops for men in Washington, D.C. jail, and young boys in youth detention centers. And I remember thinking to myself, like, and so what wound up happening was I'm in facilitating this workshop. And this was one of the young men inside the facility. And I'm like in a pod, if that makes sense. For listeners, just picture like jail and I'm in a pod, right? And I'm just with a group of young men and we're talking about poems and stuff. And one of them says, hey, Tony, that's really cool, but how does your wife feel about you being a full-time artist and a writer and a poet? And I'm assuming that person saw my wedding ring. Listeners, I'm wearing my wedding ring. And I think to myself, like, oh, they don't know that I'm gay. Oh, what do I do? And I think about this a lot. I'm like, in a place like this, the conditions, right? Homophobic. Like I understand, there's a
Yeah.
right. It's a very scary thing, and I was like, well, okay, Tony. Poetry has always made you brave, so therefore you're just gonna tell them. And so I said, all right, I'm gonna just be honest with y'all. I'm gonna just tell you. I, I'm gay. I've been married for the last, I don't know, I think at the time like 4 or 5 years. My husband loves the fact that, I'm a full-time writer and this, poet and all this stuff. So what happens is there's a 3-second silence, which is a long time in a
Yeah.
place like that. I'm like, I don't know if I'm gonna, I don't know, I need to protect myself. Like, I don't know what's gonna happen. And one of the guys gets up and starts a slow clap, right? He starts a
Wow.
slow clap. And he goes, yeah, man, it's not many people willing to admit that stuff in public. Good for you. Everybody get up. And he made the rest of the young men in there get up. And so I get a standing ovation for coming out in jail. And so through poetry. And I thought this is such a very healthy form of masculinity. But I went home and I wrote that poem thinking about, and it says the one stacked up behind bars, because I'm like, I know that statistically, I was not the only gay man there,
Right.
right? But I know that the ones who were gay probably couldn't say anything,
Yeah.
right? Or who couldn't. So for me in that moment, I'm like, I will be brave enough for you
Yes.
in this space. And I'm going to write this poem thinking about you, you know?
Yes, you've also got another line. Well, there's a couple of them that are related, but the first one is, "I do this for a reason," and you list your reasons. Say more about that because
So,
that's everything,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, I that poem also came about in 2006. So the poems are written in a series of, and I remember these particular timelines. So there are several poems that I wrote while I was in graduate school, like my master's degree, and then there was some that I wrote postmasters, and there's some that I wrote while working on my dissertation. So there's sort of like kind
Yeah.
of three time periods. Although there is one poem in Knucklehead that I wrote when I was 15, and it's relatively left slightly unchanged. I'll tell you about it in a second.
Wow.
And so I wrote this. So I was a part of and I thank these people in the back of the book. The acknowledgments is to Crystal and Toby. When I was at Penn State University working on my master's degree, I became a part of a spoken word poetry like artist collective, and we would travel to different college campuses and places, and we would perform our poems, and it was a part of just like our job. And one day I was just thinking about the audience, who's out there, because for me, and this is for listeners to know, is it's one thing to get on stage and perform, and I love a perform. I love the microphone, but it's not like a solitary experience, right? I'm like, yo, there's an audience out there. It's the same thing like if you're teaching, like there's a classroom, like there's a relationship, there's a give and pull, a call and response, and so I wanted to write something at least for the performance sake, letting the audience know I see you.
Yeah.
Like I see you. I know who you are. The one missing your daddy, although his eyes have never seen you. The one, I see you. And so that was originally a spoken word poem. And then it just, to me, magically landed on the page in this particular way. Because I was like, yeah, I think that readers will read this and be like, hey, yeah,
Mhm.
that's me too. Or that's somebody that I know. Or that does feel like, and so it's like I literally am writing for you.
Yes. Yes, and I would say even if those specific words don't characterize the reader who happens to be reading it, you still feel like you have us. You
Yes.
just feel it.
Mm. Yeah. I love that. I think that's the thing that, again, I'm continuing to learn because someone had asked me before about, how I'm experiencing, these books versus what it's like to perform on the stage. And I say, the thing that I'm continuing to learn is what the call and response is like. Because at least at a live event, I can hear people, I can see them. There's this, but I can't see readers.
Right.
Like I can't see your reaction to the poem,
Yeah.
But something that's been happening is quite a few readers, including my mother. I love the fact that my mom, and I don't come from a family of people who really like to read a lot. And I love the fact that my grandmother, who's in her 80s, has read my books.
Yeah.
But my mom says, "Baby, I finished reading Knucklehead," and she goes, "I found myself saying so many of them kind of out loud, like I was speak."
Yeah.
She goes, "There's a thing that was making me," and I was like, "Oh."
Yep.
Like that's the call and response. Like I think I'm understanding now what the response is. Like some readers are having this like talk back with me. There's this like
Yes. Yes. I found myself more than once because my kids were kind of close by as I was reading the
uh
book, and they're like, "Who are you talking to?" I'm just listening. I'm listening to the words.
yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
speaking of listening, what's really interesting also is listeners should know I self-recorded the audiobook for both How the Boogeyman Became a Poet and Knucklehead. And I just have to say, especially and Boogeyman won the American Library Association's Odyssey Award this year. So like one of the top audio anyway, but there's so much, my publishing company Harper put so much production and music behind it. And they did the same thing with Knucklehead, but y'all should just know it's interesting listening to myself read a book about myself.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Very multi-universe,
Yeah.
wild experience. But even I find myself being like, okay, Tony, like, yeah, bobbing my head a little bit, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay, I'm going to go listen to the audiobook version next because my voice out loud at the kitchen table is nothing like the experience would have been listening to you.
Probably not. Although I will say it's for me, it's been quite a joy listening to readers read some of the poems from Knucklehead out loud. It's really, really because what I'm learning is a great example this past weekend. My husband had one of his best friends over, and she was actually, I think, probably trying to be a little funny. She picks up Knucklehead and she goes, "All right, y'all, we're gonna have poetry hour. We're gonna read from Tony's book." So she like opens up a page and she starts to read one of the Dear Knucklehead letters. And she gets like midway through, not even midway through, and all of a sudden her voice starts cracking.
Yep.
And then like a little tear forms out of her eye. She looks at me, she goes, "What?" And I was like,
Got yeah.
gotcha. Like, like, yeah, this book is serious. And,
Yes.
it even got her that way. But yeah, there's something about that emotional reaction because listeners should know I have very similar emotional reactions when I write these poems. This
Yeah.
is sort of how I wrestle with my world. It really is. If I would open up my iPhone right now and go to the Notes app, there are poems in there for days.
Yeah. Oh, I love it.
Unfinished ones. I mean, there's never a goal to have a finished poem. I just kind of write
Right.
as I feel. That's what I say reflective writing. It's
Mhm.
reflective writing. This is something that I really think, especially within educational spaces, and I know it's hard because education has so many accountability standards and there's rules around classroom structure. And I'm like, yo, but reflective writing, I think, is really, really, really helpful for a lot of students,
Yeah,
adult learners as well.
absolutely. Now, I want to make sure before we wrap up that we talk about the pictures that are in the book. Because, yeah, those black and white pictures, I need you to give a little shout out to Julian and all of
Have
the
to
ways.
shout out Julian. I've never met Julian in real life. I am fascinated by Julian's work. I
Yeah.
started following Julian on social media. They are at Snakebone, I believe. And so what happened was Julian read the book and created these images on his own. I
Oh,
had no, yeah,
really?
I'm not playing. I had no
Ah,
say in any of that. And I don't mean I didn't have agency because I definitely could have said,
Right.
I was like, yo, whatever poems moves him, let him do it. And I think that Harper contracted him to do, I think, 15 images. I think it's 15 or maybe less than that. And what I got back, I was floored.
Yeah.
I was
They're
floored.
incredible. Yeah.
They're beautiful. So listeners, readers, the sketches were done by this artist who was just did images based on the poems that moved him. And they're
What else
stunning.
could you ask for in a poetry book, right? To have the illustrator work
Yes. And
in
they
that
and
way
they're
around your words.
so great.
Fun.
There's an image, by the way. Here's a nugget. I'll go back to it. There's an image of a knuckle of a seashell. And that particular image in the book of a seashell is next to a poem called Brand New Day. And Brand New Day is the poem that I wrote when I was about 15. And so I decided to keep that poem in there, but I did a slight little edit. And I think I say something like, this man, he was a boy. And that was sort of my way of letting readers know, like, this was like the original little Tony out here. So yeah,
Wow. Oh, it does. It adds yet another layer of thinking and emotion to the page.
they're
It's too
beautiful.
gorgeous.
They're
There's
beautiful.
so much. It's a book that needs to be read and then reread and then reread and
Mm.
reread and listened to. It's one of those books that's going to get worn and the spine's going to get cracked
Uh,
and
I love that.
sticky
I love
notes all over it.
I
Yeah.
love that. And I'm thinking about probably two last things. I know we probably got to wrap up. Is the very first image in the book is a picture of, I guess you would say, Knucklehead, and he's sort of like holding a planet. What looks like a planet.
Yeah.
And I write. I have a we have a really nice backyard here in Washington D.C. where we stay, and the sky is always like crystal clear. It is. I mean, it's a beautiful night sky most of the time, and I can literally see the stars. And I'm a bit of a philosopher, right? And I find myself often looking at stars, and I have these moments. I'm like. So even like right now, like, yes, Stephanie, we're on a Zoom call. I'm in my office. You are where you are, but we're also literally on a planet that is rotating in space right now.
Yeah.
Both things are happening at the same time. And I'm like, that means there's a purpose. There's some reason
Yeah.
why we're here. And because I'm a poet, I love a good metaphor. And I'm like, yo, I've created this idea that your purpose can be a planet in your belly.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And to carry that metaphor out. And so for me, the way that metaphor landed about the purpose is the very last poem in Knucklehead is about, it was originally titled Starving Artist, but it's a Dear Knucklehead poem. It's the very last poem. And I wrote that poem also around 2007, maybe 2008. And it's about realizing that at some point my economic reality will rely on my poetic balladry, meaning at some point I may really only be making a living on my art. And I did not know then that
Right.
that would be the reality. That was the planet all along was rotating in my belly that whole time. But this idea that my purpose is to be a poet. I'm doing exactly what I'm called to do, which is what I say in one of the poems in the book. Like I get it. Like I'm on
Yes.
planet to do this.
Yes. Yeah. Which then stirs something into readers of, well, what's yours?
I signed someone's book a couple of days ago. I was in New Orleans at shout out to Baldwin and Company. I love the bookstore there. I was doing an author talk, and after the event, someone said, "Can you sign my book to my planet's belly?"
Oh,
No, to my belly's planet. I think to my belly's planet. And a couple of other people were saying that too. And I think that like this idea of like, yeah, what's your planet? What's
yes.
the thing rotating? What's the thing you feel? And I just think so much, especially right now, when the narratives, especially around any person who's othered, right, marginalized, including women, right, just sort of the
Yeah.
narratives that we're hearing about ourselves right now versus sort of the planet that we feel in our belly, like this interesting tension between I know I'm supposed to be called to do something, but the world is telling me no. This idea like I'm fighting against this thing, you
Yeah.
know? Keep the planet spinning.
Keep it spinning. Yeah. As you think about, readers interacting with the book, your book just going out as far and wide as it can. We've touched upon a couple of things in our conversation, but what do you hope for? What do you hope for the book? What do you hope for readers? I don't, you're the poet, so you can wrap everything up together in a single hope because I think you have many, but what would you say?
You know what? I would say that right now, what I am the most probably hoping the most about is that young people, especially reluctant readers, fall in love with books.
Yeah.
There's a genuine joy of literacy and reading and not being afraid of language. Something that works really well with Knucklehead, and this is to all educators, especially who are listening out there. If you plan to incorporate Knucklehead in your practice or whatever, something I've learned that works really well with a lot of my book events when I go to schools, instead of giving the students the book after I speak, I make sure that books are handed out while I'm speaking, so that as I'm reciting the poems, they're reading at the same time. And what happens is there's this head nodding, there's this tolerance, and I'm teachers are saying like, Tony, I've never seen this boy read a book before, or I've never heard that student read. And I'm like, that's what I want. I want them to fall in love with language and with literacy and reading. That's really, really, really what I want. Because I was not a young person who loved to read. I did not. I'll connect this last dot. I did not enjoy reading for leisure
Yeah.
until Jason Reynolds wrote When I Was the Greatest. And I think that might have been 2014 or 2017, whenever that was. And I remember reading that book like, oh, this is one of my best friends, but oh my gosh,
Yeah.
this is so fun. This is, like,
Yeah.
this sounds like him.
Yeah.
It's
He got you. He
yeah,
got
I'm like,
you.
this is culturally, and I'm doing air quotes world. This is culturally relevant literature. This
Nice.
is what I need. And so I think the younger reader in me is still kind of catching up, but that's what I'm hoping is that there's a love, falling in love with books.
There really is there's no better thing. I knew you'd do it. I know you'd wrap everything up together and pull it together in one thing. Beautiful.
Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Now, where's the best place to find you online so readers can connect with you? They can find all the things, the links, the places. Give the shout out to where they can best find you.
Best find me. I am on social media at Tony Keith Jr. You can primarily find me on Instagram. I do have a Facebook page, and I'm not very much on Twitter or X, whatever it is. And my website, www.tonykeithjr.com. That's the best way to contact me for folks who are asking, how do I get you to come to my school? What do I do? TonyKeithJr.com has all the things.
Okay. I will make sure that I put links right to those in the show notes. And of course, I will put direct links to both of the books for listeners to grab them, which I know they're going to do after listening to your story and our conversation.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much. This
Thank you.
this was this was the fastest 50 minutes I think I've had.
It's been almost an hour. See what happens. It's the
It's
planet. We're rotating the planets. This is what we're
That's
doing.
right. That's right. Thank you so much, Tony, for
Thank
being
you.
here, for your work, for all of it.
I appreciate you. Thank you, Stephanie.
And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all of the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes and at alitlife.com. You'll also find KidLit Love on Substack. That's where you'll find posts for each episode, monthly KidLit roundups, and an invitation to join my summer book club and go deeper into the world of children's literature. And if you loved this podcast and want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of Kid Lit Love. Thanks for listening.